Sign it now, Doctor.
Never.
Stop! Let her go. Go away, stranger. You hear that, boys? One stray dog thinks he owns the canyon. Turn around, stranger, or she signs over your grave.
You got one breath to back off.
Take your hand off me.
Or what?
Or you bury 4 men by sundown.
Kill him!
Too late. Too late.
Who are you?
Later. We need to move.
Kansas, 1,882. Red Dirt Canyon. The last light of day is bleeding out. A woman hangs by her bound wrists over a roaring gorge. 20 feet of open air. Nothing below but rock and rushing water. The man crouches to her face. He's smiling. He holds out a deed. Sign the papers. Doc, he says. Last chance. She looks at him the way a woman looks at something she finds deeply unimpressive. Go to hell, she says. Then out of the canyon shadows one voice. Low, cold as the creek below. Stop. Let her go. One drifter with a scarred past. One doctor who will not break. 30 families whose lives hang on a single creek. And a man who came out of nowhere to change everything. Stay right here. This is their story, and it starts now. The sun was dying. It bled out slow over the limestone ridges of Red Dirt Canyon, turning the sky the color of a fresh wound. Down below, where the creek churned and foamed between the rocks, 3 men stood at the edge of the gorge. They were laughing. That was the worst part of it. Clara Sterling dangled over the water by her bound wrists. Her arms were lashed to a rope looped around a rotting juniper branch. The branch creaked every time the wind moved. The creek screamed below her boots. 20 feet of open air between her and those rocks, maybe 25. She didn't scream. She refused to give them that. The tallest of the 3 was a man named Cole, big jaw, small eyes, the kind of face that seemed to enjoy causing pain the way other men enjoyed a good steak. He crouched at the edge of the gorge so he could look her square in the face. Sign the papers. Doc, he said, that's all we're asking. Clara's arms burned. Her shoulders felt like they were being pulled from the sockets. She looked at Cole the way a woman looks at something she finds deeply unimpressive. Go to hell, she said. Cole straightened up and laughed. The other 2 laughed with him. The deed to Promise Creek land sat folded in his breast pocket, waiting for her signature. Blackwood wanted it clean, legal on paper. That way, when the federal judges came asking questions, there'd be nothing to see but a willing seller and an eager buyer. Clara had spent 10 years building her clinic at Promise Creek. She'd buried 3 patients there, saved 40 more. The creek fed the fields of every small farmer and tenant family in the valley below. Cherokee families, freed black families, Irish immigrants who'd arrived with nothing but the calluses on their hands. If the water dried up or got priced beyond reach, those families didn't just lose their crops. They lost everything. She held all of that in her mind. She weighed it while the rope creaked, and the canyon wind cut through her dress like a blade. Cole pulled the deed from his pocket and smoothed it against his thigh. Mr. Blackwood is a patient man, he said, drifting along the edge of the gorge. But patience has got an end to it. He glanced back at the other 2. One was stocky, missing his left ear. The other had a long scar that split his upper lip clean in half. Blackwood's men all had that look, like cruelty was something they wore. Last chance, Cole said. Clara looked past him, up at the limestone walls of the canyon. The shadows were thick up there. The sun was almost gone. She was calculating. She could see the juniper branch flexing at its base, old wood, dry. If she could swing herself toward the far wall, if there was a handhold, if the rope held long enough for her to, then she heard it. One word, low and cold as the creek water below. Stop, Cole's head snapped up. The other 2 spun around. He stepped out of the shadow of the canyon wall like he'd been part of the rock itself. Tall, lean, wearing a coat the color of dust. The brim of his hat threw a line of darkness across his eyes. But the rest of his face was stone. There was nothing theatrical about him. No speech, no performance, just those eyes, and that hand resting loose at his side. Let her go, the man said. One beat of silence. Cole recovered fast. He was the kind of man who always did. He spread his arms wide and looked at his boys with a grin. Well now, looks like the canyon grows drifters. He shook his head and pointed back toward town. Turn around. Friend, this is business between the lady and us. The drifter did not move. Let her go, he said again. Same tone, same words, like he had all the patience in the world, and none of it left. Cole's easy smile went thin. He gave the nod. The man with the scarred lip reached for his iron. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Clara would try to reconstruct it later and struggle to get the order right. The drifter's hand moved. A sound like a thunderclap shook the canyon walls. Then another, then a third. The echoes rolled through the gorge long after the smoke had already risen. Cole lay flat on his back in the dirt, staring at the sky. The stocky man had stumbled into the brush. The third was down before he'd fully cleared his holster. Silence settled in. The creek kept rushing. The canyon kept echoing. The drifter walked to the juniper branch and drew a knife from his belt. 2 cuts, and the rope gave way. Clara dropped and landed on her hands and knees on the canyon floor. Her wrists were shredded. Her shoulders screamed. She stayed there a moment, pressing her forehead almost to the dirt, just breathing. A pair of worn boots stopped in front of her. She looked up. The man crouched down and cut the rope loose from her wrists without a word. Up close, she could see the lines carved into his face, the hard set of his jaw, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and stopped being surprised by any of it. He held out a hand. She took it. Clara Sterling, she said, still catching her breath. He helped her to her feet. I know who you are. He did not offer his name. He let go of her hand and turned toward the canyon mouth, scanning the ridgeline above. The deed sat face down in the dirt at Cole's side. The rope drifted in the evening breeze and fell silently into the water below. The gorge smelled like gun smoke and iron, and the clean, cold bite of the creek. The drifter glanced back at her. We should move, he said. Clara wiped the blood from her palms. She nodded once. They moved. The canyon swallowed them. One moment, the gorge was open sky and the smell of gun smoke. And then they were moving through a narrow throat of limestone, where the walls pressed in close on both sides, and the sound of the creek followed them like something alive. The last of the daylight fell in thin slabs between the ridges above. An hour, maybe less, and there'd be nothing to see by. Clara kept pace behind the drifter, her hands still throbbing where the rope had eaten into her wrists. She'd torn a strip from the hem of her petticoat and wrapped it around the worst of the abrasions. Not a perfect solution. She'd seen worse injuries get infected from less. She made a mental note to disinfect properly as soon as they stopped. The drifter moved fast. He picked his way through the loose shale without looking down, his eyes always tracking upward, scanning the ridgeline, checking the shadows. He moved like a man who'd spent a long time learning which direction trouble usually came from. She still didn't know his name. You said you know who I am, she called to his back. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. That puts you at a disadvantage. He didn't stop. Silas Vance. She turned the name over. It rang a distant bell, the kind of bell that rings in old newspapers and second-hand rumors. But she kept that to herself. Where are we going? Silas Vance. Away from that gorge, he said. Far as we can get before dark. That was all he offered. She accepted it. She'd grown up on a Kansas homestead, and she understood that some conversations were better held when you weren't actively running for your life. She followed him deeper into the canyon. They moved for another 20 minutes before she noticed it. His stride changed, almost imperceptible at first. A slight drag of the right foot, a hitch in his breathing that wasn't there before. She'd spent 10 years watching how a body moved when something was wrong with it. A fever moved a certain way. Blood loss moved a different way altogether. She knew the difference. Silas, keep moving. Silas, stop. He stopped. He put one hand flat against the canyon wall, and that was how she knew it was bad. He wouldn't have done that if he had a choice. His jaw was set hard. His breathing was deliberate, controlled, in the way that meant he was working to control it. Clara came around to face him, under the open flap of his duster coat. dark and wet. A stain was spreading across the right side of his shirt. It had soaked through the fabric and was already beginning to drip. "When did this happen?" she said. "It's old." "That is not old blood." "Silas," he exhaled through his nose. "Old wound." The fight opened it back up. He straightened off the wall with visible effort. "It'll hold." "It will not hold," she said. "Sit down." He looked at her. She looked back. She had a voice she used with patients who were being stubborn. She didn't raise it. She didn't harden it. She just made it into something that left no space for argument. It was the voice she'd used on injured cowboys who refused to let her pull buckshot from their backs, on frightened children, on grown men who thought they were too tough to need a doctor. It worked on Silas Vance the same as it worked on everyone else. He sat down against the canyon wall with the stiff, reluctant movement of a man who would have preferred to stay upright. Clara was already pulling open the leather satchel she'd kept strapped across her body through the whole of the evening's chaos. It was a worn bag, brown with age and heavily reinforced at the straps. Inside, organized with the precision of someone who'd packed and repacked it 100 times, were the tools of her trade: bandage roll, suture kit, a small glass bottle of carbolic solution, a folded cloth dampened with willow bark extract, a tin of drawing salve, and a separate tin of the root-based paste she'd learned to make from a Cheyenne woman named Runs Far Woman, who had taught her which plants grew in these canyons and what they were good for. Silas noticed the tins. Clara watched him notice them. She didn't explain herself. She simply unstoppered the carbolic and worked with quiet efficiency, pulling his shirt away from the wound with careful fingers. The original wound was old. The scar tissue around it had that hard, puckered look of something that had been hastily stitched under poor conditions and then left to fend for itself. The fight had torn it open along the lower edge, and it was bleeding with the kind of steady persistence that said she needed to close it, or it would bleed all night. "This was never properly cleaned," she said. "Field conditions," he said. "By whom?" He paused. "Me," she said nothing to that. She cleaned the wound with the carbolic. He didn't make a sound. She'd have expected that. Men who dressed their own wounds by firelight tended to have a high threshold for the kind of pain that had a purpose. She threaded her needle from the suture kit. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. It was perhaps the one thing she was most grateful for. "You can look away," she said. "I'm fine," she began. 7 sutures, tight and even. She felt him tense with each one and release between them. He kept his jaw set and his eyes somewhere on the far wall of the canyon. She tied off the last suture and sat back. "You're going to need rest," she said. "Real rest. Not moving through a canyon in the dark. We can't stop here." "I know that. I'm saying tomorrow." She began bandaging. "And you need to eat something. Blood loss makes a man stupid." The corner of his mouth moved. She wasn't sure if it was a wince or something close to a smile. "You always talk to your patients like this. Only the ones who try to walk away from a bleeding wound," she said. She finished the bandage and sat back on her heels. The canyon had gone almost completely dark. The walls were black shapes against a purple-blue sky. The creek murmured somewhere below and to the left, somewhere up on the ridge. A nighthawk called once and went quiet. "We'll move again in an hour," Silas said. "There's a wider section of the canyon, about a mile north. Better cover." "All right." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him weighing something, the way people did when they were about to ask. A question they weren't sure they had the right to ask. "Why didn't you just sign it?" he said. Clara looked at him. "Excuse me, the deed." He kept his voice flat, neutral, like he was asking about the weather. "Blackwood's men had you over a gorge. Most people would have signed." She looked down at her hands. The wrapped strips of petticoat fabric were dark with her own blood at the wrists. She thought about the 30 families in the valley below Promise Creek. She thought about old Isaiah Washington, who'd arrived in Cedar Bend with nothing but a mule and his father's Bible, who'd broken ground on a 60-acre plot, who'd built a house with his own hands and raised 4 children in it. Isaiah's crops got their water from Promise Creek. So did the Morales family. So did the 6 remaining families of the resting wolf band, who still farmed the flats north of town. Water is a right, she said. People seem to forget that. They think it's a resource, something to be bought and priced and doled out to whoever can afford it. She shook her head. Water is a right, same as air. You don't charge a man for breathing. Silas was listening. She could tell from the quality of his silence. If I sell Promise Creek to Blackwood, he doesn't just buy land, she said. He buys control. He'll charge the valley farmers 3 times what they can afford for irrigation rights. The ones who can't pay will lose their crops. When they lose their crops, they lose their land. Blackwood buys the land at pennies on the dollar, and he sells it to the railroad, who fences it off. She looked at him steadily. 30 families, Silas, gone. Everything they built, everything they survived to build, erased. She shook her head. A life isn't something you weigh in gold. Silas said nothing. The canyon breathed around them. The creek kept running. So no, Clara said. Quieter now. I didn't sign it. He looked at the tins in her open medical bag, the ones with the Cheyenne root paste. She saw him look at them and look away. She saw the understanding move through him, slow and complete. The way understanding moves through a person when they've just been shown something they should have seen sooner. How long have you had the clinic? He said. 9 years. Opened it with $60 and a prayer. She let herself smile. Just a little. The $60 ran out in the first month. He made a sound. She thought it might be a laugh. It was brief and rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a long time. She resealed the carbolic bottle. She repacked the bag with the same careful order she'd taken it out in, outside the canyon, somewhere back towards Cedar Bend. A coyote sent up a long, lonesome wail that echoed between the walls and faded into nothing. You should eat something, too, Silas said. He produced a strip of dried venison from somewhere inside his coat and held it out. Clara accepted it without comment. They sat in the blue dark of the canyon floor, eating in silence. 2 strangers thrown together by bad luck and stubbornness, listening to the creek run over its stones. Around them, the canyon walls rose up high and close on either side, pressing the sky into a narrow ribbon of early stars. Clara thought about Promise Creek, the way the water came down, clear and cold from the high ridge, the way it spread into the valley in 3 branching channels, the way it had looked every morning for the 9 years she'd woken up beside it. She was not going to lose it. She chewed the dried venison and watched the stars and thought about what tomorrow would look like. And she did not let herself think about what those men at the gorge had planned to do if they'd grown impatient before Silas Vance came out of the shadows. Some things you survived, then you kept going. That was all. After a while, she stood and dusted the canyon grit from her skirt. And she looked at Silas where he sat against the wall. He was watching the ridge above, always watching something. Can you walk? She said. He put one hand on the canyon wall and stood, careful slower than before. Yes, he said. She picked up her bag and slung it across her body. Then let's go, she said. They walked north through the dark canyon, following the sound of the creek. 1 mile between them and the gorge, where 3 men lay still in the dirt, and the rope still drifted in the current below. The night came on fully around them. The stars burned bright and cold in that narrow strip of sky above. Clara kept her eyes forward. They moved. The cave was a shallow thing, nothing romantic about it. A depression in the limestone, face maybe 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, barely tall enough to stand upright in the center. The floor was uneven and damp toward the back wall, where water seeped through the rock in thin black rivulets. The entrance faced southwest, away from the wind that had started coming down off the ridge sometime around midnight, but it was shelter. The canyon night was cold in a way that surprised people who hadn't spent time in the Kansas hills after dark. The days burned. The nights bit. Clara had learned that lesson in her first year out here and never forgot it. She gathered wood from the deadfall at the canyon base, while Silas checked the perimeter. He moved in a wide circle around the cave entrance, looking for things she couldn't have told you how to look for. Tracks in the soft dirt along the creek bank. Broken brush, the ash ring of old fires that would tell him how many people moved through this part of the canyon, and how recently she let him do it. He knew this kind of work, and she did not. When he came back, she had a small fire going in the front part of the cave, small enough not to throw light beyond the entrance. She'd chosen dry wood, the kind that put out heat without a lot of smoke. She'd grown up around enough campfires to know the difference. Silas looked at the fire and then at her with something that might have been faint surprise. "My father ran cattle on a homestead 40 miles from here," she said. "I know how to build a fire." He sat down on the far side of it. His movements were slower than they'd been even an hour ago. She watched him try to hide it and watched him fail at hiding it. "Let me look at that bandage," she said. He started to wave her off. She gave him the voice. He sat still. She came around the fire and crouched beside him. He had to shed the duster coat and pull up his shirt. She unwrapped the outer layer of bandage carefully, checking the sutures for bleeding, checking the surrounding skin for heat. The wound had held, a little ooze at the lowest suture, which she expected. She cleaned it and dressed it again with fresh bandage from her bag, and that was when she saw his back. The firelight caught them fully. A map of scars that ran from his left shoulder blade down across the right side of his lower back, old ones, white and smooth with age. A burn scar the size of a hand on his right shoulder, the skin there drawn and irregular. 2 puckered circular marks that she recognized immediately. Bullet wounds, one near the spine, high, one lower on the left side, both old. She did not gasp. She was a doctor. She had seen damaged bodies all her life, and she understood that they held histories the same way old trees held them, in rings and layers, in the marks left behind by storms and seasons and hard years. But she went still for just a moment. Silas felt her go still. He reached for his shirt. "I'm not done," she said. He let his hand drop. She finished dressing the wound. She smoothed the bandage with 2 fingers, pressing the edges flat to make the seal. Then she sat back and she said nothing, because she understood that a person told you what they needed to tell you in their own time. And pushing at them was no different from pushing at a half-healed wound. The fire cracked. A knot of pine sap popped and sent a brief shower of orange sparks up toward the cave ceiling. The light moved across the planes of Silas's face and retreated. Half of him was lit. Half of him was dark. She could see the muscles in his jaw working. "Go ahead," he said. "I haven't asked you anything. You're thinking it." "I'm thinking a lot of things," she said. "I'm thinking that bullet near your spine should have killed you. I'm thinking that burn on your shoulder is at least 15 years old. I'm thinking whoever stitched that original side wound learned how to sew from a blind man." She paused. "I'm not thinking whatever you're afraid I'm thinking." He was quiet for a long time. The fire burned down a little. She fed it 2 more pieces of deadfall. The light steadied. "I used to work for men like Blackwood," he said. She waited. "Cattle barons, landmen, men who needed problems removed." He looked at the fire. "I was good at removing problems, meaning people, meaning whatever stood in the way." He exhaled. "Families, homesteaders, anyone who wouldn't move when they were told to move." He picked up a small piece of rock from the cave floor and turned it in his fingers. There was a town in the Texas Panhandle. Small, mostly Mexican families who'd been there 3 generations before any American cattle company knew the land was worth wanting. He stopped. Clara said nothing. "I was part of a crew that rode in and persuaded them to go." His jaw worked. That's the word they used. Persuade, like it was a conversation. He set the rock down. It wasn't a conversation. The fire popped. "The scars," she said finally. "The ones on your back. A man I wronged caught up with me in New Mexico. He had brothers." He looked down at his hands. "I didn't fight back." Clara absorbed that. She turned it over carefully in her mind, the way she turned over a diagnosis, looking at it from all angles before she committed to what it was. "Why not?" He looked at her. "Because I had it coming." She nodded slowly. She uncapped the small tin of willow bark salve and worked a little of it into the bandage edge where the skin was chafed. Her hands were steady and matter-of-fact, doing what hands did, working the problem in front of them. Our past shapes us, she said. That's true. I won't argue with it. She replaced the cap on the tin. But it doesn't chain us. She met his eyes across the firelight. The hands that pulled me from that rope tonight belong to a man. Whatever those same hands did before tonight, that's what they did tonight. I'm alive because of them. He looked at her for a long time with an expression she couldn't entirely read. You're not afraid of me, he said. Should I be? He thought about it. The thinking seemed to cost him something. Most people who know what I was are afraid of me. I'm a frontier doctor, she said. I've pulled a man's leg off below the knee with nothing but a saw and a shot of whiskey to help him through it. I've delivered babies in snowstorms. I've sat with dying men and held their hands until the end. She looked at him levelly. I don't have a lot of fear left for things that aren't actively trying to kill me. He almost smiled at that. She watched it try to happen and almost succeed. She finished packing her bag and moved back to her side of the fire. Her bones were beginning to register the full weight of the evening, now that the adrenaline had burned away. Her shoulders ached. Her wrists throbbed under their wrappings. Her knees were bruised from the fall to the canyon floor. She had survived tonight because a drifter with a violent past and a loaded gun had emerged from a shadow at exactly the right moment. She sat with the strange arithmetic of that for a while. Where are you from? She said, originally. Missouri. A pause. Long time ago. Family. He shook his head. One motion. Clean and final. She didn't follow the thread. How'd you end up in Red Dirt Canyon at dusk on a Tuesday? She said. Heard about the trouble with Blackwood. He shifted his weight carefully, accommodating the wound. I've been in Cedar Bend 3 days. Why? He looked at the fire. I owe a man there a debt. He wrote to me. He paused. Old Isaiah Washington. He was a freedman I helped once, years ago, before I got the scruples. A very faint, self-deprecating quality in that last sentence. He told me what was happening to the valley, told me about the clinic. Clara went very still. Isaiah wrote to you, she said. He did. She thought about Isaiah, 71 years old, a man who prayed every morning on the porch of the house he'd built, and who grew the best sweet corn in the county, and who had never once in the 9 years she'd known him asked anyone for anything. Isaiah had asked Silas Vance for help. She felt something tighten in her throat. She didn't let it show. He's a good man, she said quietly. He is, Silas said. The best I know. They sat in silence for a while. The fire burned down to a steadier, lower glow outside the cave entrance. The canyon was completely black. The creek was still audible, that constant low sound. Water moving over stone the way it had been moving since before anyone alive had been born, and would keep moving long after everyone alive was gone. Clara lay down on her side, using her medical bag as a pillow. She kept her coat on. She closed her eyes and then opened them again. Silas, she said. Yeah, get some sleep. I'll take first watch. He started to argue. You lost blood tonight, she said. I didn't. I'll wake you in 3 hours. A pause. Then the sound of him shifting against the cave wall. Settling in. 3 hours, he said. 3 hours. She watched the cave entrance and listened to the canyon. The fire threw long, warm shadows up the walls. An hour in, she turned and saw that Silas had gone fully still, his chest rising and falling slow and even, his hat tilted low over his face. The hard lines around his mouth had eased in sleep. He looked younger. He looked tired in the deep, bone-level way of a man who had been tired for a very long time. Clara turned back to the canyon entrance. She thought about the 30 families in the valley. She thought about Promise Creek and the cold, clear water that came down off the ridge each morning. She thought about Thaddeus Blackwood sitting in his office in Cedar Bend and what his face would look like when he found out his 3 men had failed. She thought about that last part for a while. Then she stopped thinking about it, because some things you dealt with when they arrived and not before. The creek ran on in the dark. The fire held. She kept watch. Thaddeus Blackwood did not raise his voice. That was the thing people misunderstood about him. They expected a man like him to yell, to throw things, to turn red-faced and blustery the way powerful men did in dime novels. Blackwood had read a few of those novels and found them amusing in the way that small errors are amusing when you know the truth. He sat behind his desk in the Cedar Bend Land and Cattle Office, and he listened to the man in front of him deliver the news. And when the man was done talking, Blackwood folded his hands on the blotter and said nothing for a long time. The man in front of him was sweating, despite the evening cool. His name was Pruitt. He was one of 3 trackers Blackwood kept on retainer for situations that required discretion. Cole and the others had been found by a passing mule skinner at the canyon gorge. Cole was unconscious and would likely wake up with a cracked skull and a permanent ringing in his left ear. The other 2 were in worse shape. And the woman, Blackwood said. Gone, Pruitt said. Tracks led north up the canyon. Then nothing. Whoever took her knew the terrain. A drifter, Blackwood said. That's what the mule skinner said. Saw a man matching the description coming into town 3 days ago. Tall, brown duster. No identifying find him, Blackwood said. Pruitt nodded quickly and left. Blackwood stood and went to the window. Cedar Bend spread out below him in the early evening. Lantern light coming on in windows. The main street quiet and dusty. He could see the outline of the church steeple, and beyond it, the dark line of the hills that separated the town from the valley farms. He pressed 2 fingers to the glass and looked at those hills. He had come to Cedar Bend 14 months ago with a surveyor's map, a banknote for $120,000, and a plan that he had spent 7 years constructing from the ground up. The water rights to Promise Creek were the centerpiece of that plan, the load-bearing wall that everything else depended on. With control of the water, he controlled the valley. With the valley, he could move the railroad through on his terms, buy the land from desperate families at a fraction of its value, and resell it for a profit that would make his current fortune look like pocket change. It was not complicated. He had done versions of it before, in Colorado and in New Mexico and once in Arizona. It was simply a matter of applying the right pressure to the right people in the right order. Clara Sterling was the problem he had not planned for. He had expected a woman running a small medical clinic to fold under the first serious pressure. Most people did. The human instinct for self-preservation was reliable and consistent, and Blackwood had built his entire business model on top of it. Clara Sterling apparently lacked that instinct. He turned from the window and called out the open office door. "Send for Elias," he said. He waited, 3 miles east of his office, on the flat farmland that spread south of the creek. A barn was burning. The family who owned it were named Dupree. They were freedmen. 3 generations settled in the Kansas Valley, the grandfather having come north from Tennessee after the war with nothing but $40 of savings and a determination so solid it had weight to it. His son had expanded the farm. His grandson, Marcus Dupree, now ran it. 110 acres of corn and wheat, a dairy operation with 12 cows, a family of 6 that included 4 children between the ages of 4 and 11. Blackwood's men had come at dusk, while Marcus was in town, while his wife, Lena, was putting the children to bed. They'd come quiet, the way they always did, and they'd put a torch to the east side of the barn, where the dry hay was stacked. By the time Lena smelled the smoke and got outside, the whole structure was going. She got the cows out. She stood in the yard with her children pressed behind her, the 4 of them watching the fire eat the barn their great-grandfather had built with salvaged lumber and borrowed tools. And she could do nothing but watch it go. The neighbors came. The Morales family from a quarter-mile east. Tomas Morales arriving at a dead run with a bucket brigade that did nothing against a fire that size. Old Samuel Pickett from the next farm over, a white-haired farmer with arthritic hands who stood beside Lena in helpless solidarity. The Nakamura family, who ran a small truck farm on the south end of the valley, arrived with their older son and watched with the rest of them. These were the families of the valley. Different names, different faces, different origins. All of them drinking from the same creek. All of them watching the same fire. Across town, on the main street, Sheriff Roy Holden sat on the front porch of the jailhouse and listened to the sound of the Dupree barn going up. He could see the orange glow on the eastern horizon from where he sat. He could smell the smoke. In his right hand, he held a glass of rye whiskey. In his left, a canvas bag. The bag was heavy. Blackwood had sent it 3 days ago with a polite note written in the man's precise, regular handwriting. The note said it was in appreciation of Holden's continued cooperation and professionalism in an era of civic growth. It was the third such bag in 6 months. Holden looked at the orange glow on the horizon. He took a drink of rye. The smoke smell was getting stronger. He could hear, very faintly, the sound of someone crying. The wind carried it in fragments. A woman's voice. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself that a lot these days. He took another drink and looked down at the bag in his hand. The gold inside was cool and dense and absolutely silent, the way money always was. It never said anything about where it came from. It just sat there being money, indifferent to the fire on the horizon and the woman crying in the smoke. Roy Holden had been a lawman for 22 years. He'd ridden with a federal marshal in his 20s, chasing down cattle thieves across 3 territories. He'd been shot twice in the line of duty. He'd built a reputation in 3 counties as a fair and reliable man. He looked at the glow on the horizon. He put the bag down on the porch beside his boot. He did not get up. Inside his chest, something continued the slow, quiet process of rotting that had been going on for 6 months, like wood left in standing water. It didn't happen fast. It just happened, inch by inch, until the day you put your weight on something you thought was solid, and it gave way underneath you. Holden refilled his glass, and across the street, above the darkened window of a dress shop that had been closed since its owner left Cedar Bend 2 months ago, under circumstances nobody wanted to discuss. A second-story apartment sat empty. Nobody thought much about it. Nobody had reason to. 3 weeks earlier, before Clara was taken, before Blackwood's men burned the first field of winter wheat, Clara had been in that apartment with a woman named Ruth Keene, who ran a boarding house on the south end of town. They'd been discussing which families were most at risk from Blackwood's pressure campaign. Clara had made a list in her careful, small handwriting. The Duprees were near the top of it. She had known this was coming. She had been trying to build a legal strategy with the federal courthouse in Topeka. She had written 3 letters. The first 2 went unanswered. The third produced a form reply that said a federal land inspector would be dispatched to Cedar Bend within 90 days. 90 days was a long time in a valley with 1 water source and a man who was willing to burn things down. She had been trying to outpace the fire. She'd been 1 step slow. It had been eating at her in the canyon the night before, though she hadn't mentioned it to Silas. She carried it the way she carried most hard things, close and quiet and out of sight. The morning 2 weeks before her kidnapping, she'd seen it clearly in her clinic. Isaiah Washington had come in for his arthritis treatment, the root preparation that helped more than anything the Eastern medical catalogs offered. She'd had him situated on a cot near the window where the morning light came in warm and easy on his joints. His knuckles were bad that week. She'd been working the preparation in when the door opened and Gerald Marsh walked in. Gerald Marsh was the mayor's son, 23 years old, red-faced, generally useless, and currently sporting a bad laceration on his palm from a knife-whittling accident he'd suffered in a state of inebriation the previous evening. He stood in the clinic doorway and looked at Isaiah on the cot near the window. He looked at the cot on the other side, which was empty. He looked at Clara. His expression went through several things in quick succession. She watched them move across his face, and she said nothing. She simply looked at him with the calm expectation of a woman who had been running this clinic for 9 years and had made her position clear through 9 years of consistent action. Gerald Marsh crossed the room and sat down on the empty cot. Clara finished with Isaiah's hands and came around to see to the mayor's son. She cleaned the laceration and closed it with 3 sutures. Gerald Marsh watched the old black man resting 10 feet away from him with an expression she could not entirely read. When she was tying off his last suture, he said, "My father's going to back Blackwood, you know." "I know," she said. He thinks it's progress. Your father is welcome to his opinion. The whole town's going to go along, Gerald said. He wasn't being cruel, she realized. He was just stating it the way he saw it. You can't fight all of them. She tied off the suture and cut the thread and leaned back. Go home and rest that hand, she said. Change the dressing in 2 days. Come back in a week and I'll check the sutures. Gerald Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Isaiah, who had fallen into a light doze in the warm morning light, his chest rising and falling slow. Gerald got up and walked to the door. He paused there. Good morning, Mr. Washington, he said. Isaiah opened one eye. Morning, son. Gerald nodded once and left. Clara stood in the center of her clinic, between the 2 cots, in the warm morning light, and she thought about what it cost a person to change and what it cost them not to, about how change almost always started small and unannounced. A man saying good morning to another man across a room. A small thing, easy to miss. But she had been watching the valley for 9 years, and she knew that all the big things started small. She had believed that then. She believed it now. Standing in the smoke smell of a burned barn, with a canyon cave still in her bones, and a drifter's sutures on her wrist, and Blackwood's men scouring the county looking for her. She believed it, because she had to, because the only alternative was giving up. And that was something Clara Sterling had never once in her life been able to figure out how to do. The Dupree barn burned through the night. The glow on the horizon was still visible before dawn. And in his office at Cedar Bend Land and Cattle, Thaddeus Blackwood met with Elias Thorne for the first time and explained exactly what he needed. Elias listened with his pale eyes on the desk between them and said nothing until the end. Then he said, I can find them. Blackwood looked at him. I need more than found. Elias Thorne reached across the desk and picked up his fee from the blotter. He counted it without rushing. He put it in his breast pocket. Then I'll find them thoroughly, he said. Dawn came in thin and gray. The canyon walls held the night longer than the open sky did, so it was still dim and cold when Clara woke. She sat up and found Silas already upright on his side of the dead fire, watching the entrance with the stillness of a man who'd been awake for a while. You were supposed to wake me, she said. You needed the sleep. She started to argue and stopped herself. She probably had. She rolled her neck, heard it crack in 2 places, and stood up. Her wrists had stiffened overnight. She unwrapped them and rewrapped them tighter, while Silas broke down the small camp with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. He scattered the ash from the fire with his boot. He kicked loose rock over the darker ground where the fire had sat. They'll track us anyway, Clara said. Probably. He picked up his coat, but no reason to make it easy. She picked up her bag. She thought about what she knew about this canyon. She had ridden through Red Dirt Canyon on horseback 12 times over the years, making house calls to families in the outlying farms. She knew its geography the way you knew the layout of your own house in the dark. You didn't think about it. You just knew where everything was. She knew about the bottleneck. There's a place, she said, about a mile north and then west, where the canyon narrows to maybe 12 feet across. Both walls go straight up for 100 feet. Flash flood channel on the east side. She paused. There's an abandoned silver mine up on the left ridge. They worked it about 15 years ago and gave it up when the vein ran out. The support timbering is still in place. Silas looked at her. Old dry rotted wood, she said, holding about 40 tons of loose rock and shale above it. He was quiet for a moment, working through it the way she'd worked through it herself in the pre-dawn dark when the idea first came to her. That's a canyon trap, he said. Yes, if we go in, we go in. We're already in, she said. They're behind us. They'll catch us in open ground before we reach the north end. She looked at him steadily. But if they follow us into a 12-foot passage, and I know where the weak point is, you'd bring a rock slide down on them. I'd bring a rock slide down between us and them, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't read. Then he looked north up the canyon. Show me, he said. They moved fast. The gray light grew as they walked. The canyon walls going from black to brown to the rust-red color that gave the place its name. The creek ran alongside them, louder now in the morning, quiet. Clara kept her eyes on the terrain. She knew this land. She had ridden along the ridge above this section to reach the Nakamura farm. She had stopped once at the mine entrance out of curiosity and climbed partway up the shale to look at the timbering. She had noted it the way she noted things, carefully, filed it away without knowing why. She knew why now. They were half a mile in when Silas put a hand out and stopped her. She froze. He was looking back the way they'd come. His head was slightly tilted, like a man listening for something specific in a lot of noise. She stayed absolutely still and listened too, there, under the sound of the creek, the faint, distinct sound of shale shifting under a boot, then another. Then the quiet sound of men moving who believed they were being quiet. Clara counted. 3, she thought, maybe 4. How far? She mouthed. Silas held up 4 fingers, then pointed back. 400 yards, maybe. He pointed forward and then pointed at her. Move, now. She moved. They went faster. Clara led now. She knew this section better than he did, and they both understood that without discussion. She turned west at a natural fork where the canyon branched, and there it was, the bottleneck, just as she remembered it. The walls rose on both sides, shearing, straight up, smooth and rust-colored, so close you could stretch your arms out and nearly touch both of them at once. The floor was loose gravel and the remains of old flash flood debris, rounded rocks and drifted sand, and the occasional bleached bone of some animal that hadn't read the terrain correctly. Above the left wall, maybe 60 feet up the shale slope that swept away from the canyon rim, she could see the dark opening of the mine and the gray wooden skeleton of the old support frame. Even from here, she could see how the timbering had gone. One upright was already cracked nearly through at the base. The horizontal beam above it leaned at an angle that was doing its best impression of horizontal while being approximately 15 degrees from it. Above the frame, a long skirt of loose shale ran back from the rim, 100 tons, maybe more. There, she said quietly. She pointed. Silas looked up and assessed it the way she imagined he assessed most things. Quickly, completely, without sentiment. You want me to shoot out the upright, he said, the cracked one on the right side. The whole frame will go. He looked at the angle. He looked at the distance. That's a long shot with a pistol. Can you make it? He looked at her. Yes. Then we go through, she said. We come out the other side. They follow us in. And you take the shot. A sound carried down the canyon. Closer now. A voice low and directed. Men being organized. Now, Silas said. They went through the bottleneck at a near run. The walls pressed in on both sides. Clara's shoulder scraped the left face. The gravel shifted under her boots, and she caught herself twice. Silas was directly behind her. She could hear his breathing, still controlled, still deliberate, with that slight roughness that told her the side wound was making itself known. They came out the other side into a wider section of canyon. An old mule trail ran up the right wall here, switchbacking its way to the rim. Clara stopped and turned, 30 yards back. The bottleneck framed the eastern canyon like a doorway. Silas was already looking up at the mine. The angle was sharp, through the bottleneck opening, up and to the left. The cracked upright was just visible. The early light caught it obliquely, throwing the crack into shadow. I see it, he said. Then the first of the trackers came through the bottleneck. He came through fast and low, and he pulled up sharp when he saw them, his hand going for his gun. Behind him, the second man was already coming through, and behind him the third. And there was no more time to think about angles and distances. Silas drew and shot in one motion, not at the men. He shot up and left, at a target 60 feet above and 50 feet back, at a cracked piece of dry timber that was holding the weight of a hillside. For one suspended moment, nothing happened. Then the upright gave. The sound it made was nothing like an explosion. It was quieter than that, a deep, tearing crack, like the earth itself splitting along an old seam. The horizontal beam dropped. The frame buckled, and then the shell came. It came in a wave, not fast the way water was fast, faster than that, a solid brown-gray curtain of rock and earth that swept down the slope and hit the canyon floor with a sound like the end of the world. The ground shook. The walls of the canyon channeled the shale and the dust and the thundering weight of it, all directly into the mouth of the bottleneck. The three trackers scrambled back the way they'd come. Clara saw one of them go down, rolling, coming up again and running. The dust swallowed them. The rock slide filled the bottleneck entrance from floor to rim with compacted shale and rubble, a wall of debris 20 feet thick in about 4 seconds. Then it was over. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Clara had ever heard. Dust rolled over them in a thick brown cloud. She could taste it on her teeth. She couldn't see 2 feet in front of her. She was coughing, one arm up to cover her mouth and nose, turning away from the worst of it. She turned directly into Silas. He had moved without her hearing him through the roar. He was behind her, both arms coming up instinctively, pivoting her and pressing her back against the canyon wall, with his body between her and the dust and debris that was still cascading down in lighter trickles. His chest was against her shoulder. His arm was braced on the wall beside her head. His face was inches from hers, turned toward the debris field, eyes shut against the dust. The last of the smaller rocks pattered down and stopped. The dust began to settle. In the quiet, Clara became aware of several things at once. The warmth of him, the solid weight of him, the sound of his breathing, close and rough, right next to her ear. The way her own breathing had gone shallow and had not resumed its normal rhythm. She turned her head. He was already turning his. Their faces were very close in the settling dust. His eyes found hers and stayed there. The canyon was completely silent, except for the distant sound of the creek. She watched something move through his expression. It wasn't a simple thing. It moved in layers, like weather, something that might have been want, something that immediately followed it and complicated it. Something behind both of those things that looked like a man standing at a door he didn't believe he had the right to open. His eyes stayed on hers for one more second. Then he pushed back off the wall and stepped away. He turned toward the debris field and checked his gun. He reloaded the spent chamber with the measured movements of a man doing a practical task and thinking only about that task. Clara stood against the canyon wall and breathed. She was a practical woman. She understood her own body and what it was capable of and what it was doing at any given moment. She understood exactly what had just happened inside her chest in that one suspended second when he'd looked at her. She also understood, from the way he'd pulled back, that he didn't believe he was worth what she was feeling. She filed that away. She picked up her medical bag from where she'd dropped it in the chaos. She checked its contents quickly, making sure nothing had broken. "They won't be following us through that," she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. "No," he said, "they won't." He kept his eyes on the debris field. She kept hers on her bag. The dust continued to settle around them, coating everything in a thin layer of rust-colored grit. "We need to reach town," she said. "I have to know what Blackwood has done while we've been out here." "Agreed. There's a way up to the rim about a quarter-mile ahead, the old mule trail. We can come down on the north side of Cedar Bend and come in through the freight yard." He holstered his gun and looked at her then, fully, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand. She looked back at him with the same directness she brought to everything. She didn't look away. She didn't make it easy for him to look away, either. She just held his gaze for a moment and let whatever was in it be what it was. Then she turned north and started walking. After a beat, she heard him follow. Cedar Bend at night had a particular quality. It wasn't a comfortable quiet. It was the quiet of a place holding its breath. Too still, too careful. The kind of quiet that settled over a town when people had decided it was safer to stay indoors. Clara noticed it the moment they came down off the ridge and into the outskirts through the freight yard. The usual sounds were missing. The Callahan brothers normally argued outside their shop until 9 or 10 o'clock. Old Pete Sawyer sat on the bench outside the feed store every evening and played a battered harmonica until his wife came to fetch him. The Morales girls chased each other across the street after supper. their laughter carrying 2 blocks. Nothing. Just the creak of a freight wagon wheel in the wind and the distant whicker of a horse from the livery. Silas felt it too. She could tell by the way he slowed and moved closer to the building faces, keeping out of the lantern light that spilled from windows. They went up the alley behind the hardware store. Clara knew this alley. She'd walked it 100 times, cutting through to her clinic from the south end of town. She knew the way the ground dipped on the left side, where the rain always pooled. She knew the cat that lived under the hardware loading dock. She knew that the 4th board in the back fence of the dry goods store was loose and could be slid sideways. She led. He followed. They moved without speaking. Through the boards of a fence, she could see the main street. Blackwood's office had lights burning on the 2nd floor. The sheriff's jailhouse was lit up downstairs. 2 men she didn't recognize were standing at the corner of the main street and Miller Road, talking low. Blackwood's men. She could tell by the way they stood. A certain quality of patience in it. Men being paid to wait. She pulled back from the fence. Silas was right behind her, close enough that she could speak directly into his ear without raising her voice above a breath. 2 on the corner, she said. I saw them, he murmured. 2 more on the far side of the street near the hotel. 4 men watching the main approaches. Blackwood had pulled in his net. My clinic is 2 blocks north, she said. Isaiah's house is on the far side of town. We need to get word to him. 1 thing at a time, Silas said. They worked their way north through the alley system. Cedar Bend was a grid town, laid out by a man with a surveyor's sensibility and no imagination. The alleys ran straight and parallel, and Clara knew every one of them. She turned them east, then north, then west again when she spotted another of Blackwood's sentries leaning against the back gate of the livery. They were in the alley behind the barber shop when Silas stopped. Just stopped, like a door shutting. Clara almost walked into his back. She caught herself, 1 hand on the alley wall, and looked past him. The alley ahead was empty, dark, the usual alley. Nothing she could see. Then she heard it. Click. A small sound. Precise. Metallic. The sound of a well-maintained mechanism moving through its intended motion. Then the brief whisper of a chain. And then the hollow, tuneful report of a brass pocket watch chiming the quarter hour. She felt Silas go rigid. Not the alertness he carried all the time. The constant readiness she'd grown used to in the past day. This was different. This was the kind of stillness that comes before something a person already knows is coming. Silas, said a voice from the dark ahead. Well, a man stepped out from the shadows beside the barber shop's back door. He was tall, slim in a way that looked like wire, like something under tension. His hat was black, and his coat was black, and his face, when the distant lantern light caught it, was long and angular and pale. His right hand was in his coat pocket. The other hung loose at his side. The pocket watch chain glinted at his vest. Been a while, the man said. He had a flat voice. No color in it. You look terrible. By the way, Elias, Silas said. The name fell out of him like something dropped from a height. Elias Thorne took 2 more steps forward and stopped. He looked past Silas at Clara, with the same expression you might give a piece of furniture you were considering buying, briefly assessing, mostly indifferent. That her? He said. Silas said nothing. The water woman. Elias looked at Clara a moment longer, then back at Silas. Long way to come for a water dispute. Silas, even for you. What are you doing here, Elias? Elias tilted his head. He looked genuinely amused, in the way that men with no warmth left in them can still produce a reasonable facsimile of amusement. Same as always. Working. For Blackwood. Man pays well. Pays better than moral convictions. I've always found. Silas had gone very still beside Clara. She could feel the quality of it. She'd felt him still before. In the canyon. In the cave. This was different. This stillness came from a deeper place. How long? Silas said. 2 weeks. Elias reached into his coat pocket, and the hand came out with the watch. He turned it over once, unhurried, then put it back. An old habit, Clara thought. Something he did without thinking about it. Long enough to hear about you and your new charitable inclinations. Long enough to hear about the 3 men you left at the gorge. He paused. Long enough to find you tonight. You could have sent his other men. Silas said. You didn't have to come yourself. I wanted to see it for myself. Elias said. I didn't believe what they told me. Silas Vance, playing the hero for a country doctor. He shook his head with that hollow amusement. We rode together for 6 years. Silas, I know what you are. What I was. Elias looked at him for a moment. You think there's a difference. I know there is. That's touching, Elias said. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it the way you say something you find genuinely sad. Listen to me. Blackwood is paying me very well to solve this problem. If you walk away tonight, I only have the woman to deal with. You take your horse and you ride north, and this is none of your business anymore. He paused. You don't owe these people anything. I don't owe them anything. Silas agreed. I'm here anyway. Elias studied him. Something shifted in his pale eyes. Not softening. Something more like recalibration. The adjustment a man makes when the variable he'd counted on turns out to be different from what he expected. You've known this man how long? He looked at Clara. 2 days less. You'd die for her. I'm not planning to die, Silas said. That's also not the point, Clara said. Both men looked at her. She hadn't spoken until now. She'd been watching Elias Thorne with the steady attention she gave to things she needed to understand clearly. The point is 30 families in the valley below that creek, she said. It doesn't matter how long Silas has known me. That's not what this is about. She looked at Elias directly. You know what Blackwood is doing. You know who he's doing it to. You've been here 2 weeks. You've seen it. Elias looked at her without expression. What's your point, ma'am? My point is that you're a man making a choice, she said. Same as everyone else. Same as him. She looked at Silas briefly. The choice is still open. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. It was a short sound, not exactly unkind, but entirely empty of any of the things that made laughter worth hearing. I appreciate the sermon, he said. He looked back at Silas. Walk away. Silas, this ends better for you if you do. I'm not walking away. Then I'll see you tomorrow, Elias said, in the light, where I can do this properly. He reached into his pocket again, and the watch chimed once more. He looked at it, closed it, and put it back. I always liked you, he said to Silas. It sounded like the truth. That's the genuinely unfortunate part of this. He turned and walked back into the shadows beside the barber shop. The darkness took him the same way it had given him up, completely and without ceremony. The alley was empty again. Clara let out a breath she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding. She looked at Silas. His eyes were on the spot where Elias had disappeared. She watched his jaw work. She watched him come back from wherever he'd gone. She understood that Elias Thorne wasn't just a problem standing in an alley. He was something more complicated than that. Something with 6 years of shared history in it. Something that lived in the same place as the scars on Silas's back. How long have you known him? She said. Since we were both young enough to be stupid for money instead of just greedy. He exhaled. He pulled me out of a ditch in New Mexico once. I pulled him out of a burning building in Colorado. A pause. We rode together a long time. And then I stopped, he said. He didn't. She let that sit for a moment. He meant what he said, Silas said, about tomorrow. I know. He doesn't make promises he doesn't intend to keep. Neither do I, she said. He looked at her. The lantern light from the street filtered into the alley, just enough to show her his face, half lit and half dark, the same way the firelight had shown it in the cave. She was starting to think that was simply how he was, that there was always part of him in shadow, and that the shadow was not a hiding place, so much as where he lived. She reached out and put her hand briefly on his arm. He looked down at her hand. She felt him go still with it in the same way he went still with everything. Processing. Deciding he can still choose differently, she said. People do. Not Elias. You did. He had nothing to say to that. She could see it in his face, the way a true thing sometimes landed. She took her hand back. Come on, she said. We need to get to Isaiah's side of town before dawn. She moved north up the alley. She heard him fall in behind her. That familiar sound of his boots on packed dirt, steady and close. The alley stretched ahead of them. dark and narrow, and full of the town's held breath. They moved through it. Isaiah Washington's house smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and something sweet that Clara later identified as sweet potato bread cooling on the kitchen shelf. It was the most comforting smell she had encountered in 2 days, and it hit her harder than she expected. Isaiah himself was sitting at his kitchen table when they came in through the back door. He was not asleep. He was not surprised to see them. He had a Bible open on the table in front of him and a cup of coffee beside it, and the look of a man who had been sitting in the same chair through the same long night for many hours. When he saw Clara, his expression did something careful. He stood slowly, his arthritic joints protesting, and he took her hands in both of his and looked at her face for a moment without speaking. "Sit down," he said, "both of you." They sat. He put coffee in front of them and disappeared into the back room. He came back with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth and sat it beside Clara without comment. She unwrapped her wrists and cleaned them while Silas told Isaiah, in a low and straightforward voice, what had happened at the gorge, in the canyon, and in the alley behind the barber shop. Isaiah listened with his eyes on the table, his big hands folded in front of him. The coffee cup steamed. The sweet potato bread sat on the shelf. Outside the kitchen window, the night was still dark, but with the particular softness at the edges that meant dawn was thinking about it. When Silas finished, Isaiah sat quiet for a moment. "Dupree Barn is gone," he said. Clara closed her eyes briefly. "Lena and the children are safe," Isaiah said. "They're at the Morales place tonight. But the barn's gone, and the cows scattered. Marcus got back from town after it was already burning." He paused. 3 fields of winter wheat on the south end of the valley were cut before they burned them. "Somebody went through in the night with blades." "Blackwood," Silas said. "Blackwood's orders." Isaiah said. "Whether he held the torch himself doesn't much matter." He looked at Clara. "He's trying to draw you out." "I know. Holden's not doing a thing," Isaiah said. "He sat on his porch last night and watched the glow from the Dupree farm and did nothing." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "What about the federal courthouse?" Silas said. "You wrote a letter." 3 letters, Clara said. She set the cloth down and looked at her hands. "Clean now. The abrasions raw and pink in the lamplight. The inspector is coming in 90 days. "We don't have 90 days," Isaiah said. "No," she said, "we don't." She looked at the window. The sky outside was beginning to move from black to dark blue. Dawn was coming, and with it, whatever Elias Thorne had promised in that alley. She thought about the Valley families, the Duprees in the ruins of what had been, the Morales family taking people in, the Nakamuras, the Pickett family, old Samuel and his sons, the half-dozen Irish tenant families on the north end whose names she knew as well as she knew her own, the remaining resting wolf families who farmed the northern flats and who had been dealing with men like Blackwood since before Kansas was a state. She thought about what they all had in common. They were not helpless. That was the thing. That was the thing people like Blackwood always miscalculated. He looked at poor people and marginalized people and people who had been pushed to the edges, and he saw helplessness. He saw softness. He saw easy prey. He had never stopped to consider what it meant that these families had survived everything that had already been done to them and were still here, still farming, still building, still breathing. That wasn't helplessness. That was something else entirely. "I need to talk to them," Clara said. "All of them. Today." Silas looked at her. "Blackwood's men are watching the roads. Then we use the creek paths," she said. "Isaiah, can you get word to the Morales family and to Ruth Keene at the boarding house?" Isaiah was already nodding. "My grandson can ride before first light. I need everyone who is willing to meet at the old feedlot south of the freight yard, the one the railroad abandoned. Blackwood's men don't watch it because there's nothing there to watch." She looked at Silas. "Can you get us there without walking past any of his sentries?" He thought for a moment. She watched him run the town's grid through his head. "Yes," he said. "Good." She stood and picked up her medical bag. She opened it and checked her supplies with the quick efficiency of routine. She had enough bandage material for 6 or 8 people. She had the suture kit and the cabalic. She had her salves and her root preparations. She had a small folded paper of willow bark powder and another of her fever preparation. She closed the bag. Isaiah watched her do this. His old eyes were reading something in it. "You're going to treat people," he said, "while you talk to them." "I'm going to do what I do," she said. "I'm going to take care of people. What they decide after that is up to them." Isaiah looked at her for a long time, with an expression she recognized. It was the expression people had when they believed in something more than they could easily say. He nodded once. Then he bowed his head and said something under his breath that she thought was a prayer. The feedlot had once held 300 head of cattle at a time. The railroad had built it when they were laying track through the Southern Valley and expected the cattle business to follow. The cattle business had not followed, at least not on the railroad's terms, and the feedlot had sat empty for 8 years. The fencing was rotted in places. The 2 loading structures had gone gray with weather. It sat in a natural depression in the land that made it invisible from the road until you were right on top of it. By the time the sun was fully over the ridge, there were 40 people in that feedlot. Clara hadn't expected 40. She'd hoped for 20. The families had arrived by ones and twos through the creek paths and the brush breaks that ran along the south end of the valley, coming on foot and on mule, and in a few cases on horseback. Marcus Dupree came. His wife Lena came. Tomas Morales came with his 2 grown sons and his wife Rosa. Old Samuel Pickett came with his 3 boys, the Nakamura family, 6 of the Irish tenant farmers, the 2 remaining families of the resting wolf band, represented by a quiet woman named Stanzenwaiter and her adult son. Ruth Keene from the boarding house came. She was a stout, practical woman with gray braids and the look of someone who had survived a lot and learned from all of it. There were others, people Clara knew by face but not always by name, people who had heard what was happening and had come anyway. 40 people standing in an abandoned feedlot in the morning light. Some with rifles, some without, all of them with the same look. The look of people who had run as far back as they were going to run. Clara stood in the center of them. She opened her medical bag. "Who's hurt?" she said. "Who needs looking at? Let's start there." She hadn't planned a speech. She wasn't a speech maker. She was a doctor who showed up where she was needed and did what needed doing. She understood that the most powerful thing she could give these people was not inspiration. They didn't need inspiration. They'd been inspiring themselves for years. What they needed was to feel like someone was paying attention. Someone competent and reliable who was going to be there when things got hard. So she started with the work. Lena Dupree had smoke-burned hands from trying to fight the barn fire. Clara cleaned and dressed them while they talked. Rosa Morales' youngest son had been sick for 4 days with a fever she'd been afraid to bring him to town to treat. Afraid of Blackwood's men. Afraid of drawing attention. Clara had the boy sit down on a loading platform, and she examined him carefully and mixed up a fever preparation from her bag and gave Rosa the instructions clearly and without making her feel stupid for waiting. Old Samuel Pickett had a wound on his forearm he'd gotten from a cut fence post 3 days ago that was showing the early signs of infection. She cleaned it and used the drawing salve and told him exactly what to watch for and what it meant if it changed. She worked through the people the way she always worked, steady, unhurried, one person at a time. And while she worked, people talked. Marcus Dupree talked about the barn. He talked about it with his jaw tight and his eyes dry, the way a man talked about something he hadn't finished being angry about yet. His grandfather had built that barn. His grandfather had been born into slavery and had walked north after the war with his wife and a mule and had built that barn out of salvaged lumber and sheer refusal. The barn was not just a building. The barn was a statement. It said, "We are still here. We did not leave." Tomas Morales talked about what was coming if Blackwood got the water rights. He had family in New Mexico who had watched the same thing happen. The water goes, and then the land goes, and then the people go, scattered across the country like seeds in a dry year, most of them never taking root anywhere again. Ruth Keene talked about the women Blackwood had pressured out of their businesses in town. The dress shop owner who'd left 2 months ago. The laundry woman who'd been refused a renewal on her lease for no stated reason after 20 years. Stanzenwaiter said nothing during all of this. She stood at the edge of the group with her son beside her, and she listened with the expression of someone who had heard this particular story many times and in many different forms and was entirely unsurprised by any of it. Clara finished with the last patient. A teenage boy with a badly sprained wrist he'd gotten in the rush to fight the Dupree fire. She stood up and looked at the people around her. 40 faces in the morning light. Patient, tired, full of something she recognized as being right at the edge of breaking. The place where you either broke down or you broke through. Blackwood is going to make his move today, she said. He's going to force a confrontation. He's hoping you stay home. He's hoping you're afraid enough to keep your doors shut and your heads down. She paused. He's been counting on that since the day he arrived. The feedlot was very quiet. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it isn't dangerous, she said. It is. I'm not going to promise you it ends well. I don't know how it ends. What I know is what Promise Creek is. What I know is what it means to 30 families if Blackwood buys it and shuts the tap. She looked around at all of them. I know what each of you built. I know what it cost. And I know you didn't survive what you survived to hand it over to a man who thinks your lives are worth less than his ledger book. No one moved. Stanzenwaiter stepped forward from the edge of the group. She looked at Clara for a moment. My people have been watching men like Blackwood since before this territory had a name, she said. Her voice was level and unadorned. We do not have 30 families in the valley. We have 2, but we will be there. Tomas Morales said. We'll be there. Marcus Dupree said. We'll be there. It went around the feedlot, not dramatically, not like a speech, person by person, in plain voices, the way decisions were made by people who had thought about it for a long time and didn't need a dramatic moment to tell them what they already knew. Silas had been standing at the perimeter of the feedlot the entire time, watching the access paths for trouble. He watched the people in the feedlot with an expression Clara couldn't fully see from across the distance. She thought it looked like something being revised, a person reconsidering an old assumption. On the far side of the feedlot, half behind the rotted timber of the loading structure, Roy Holden stood in the shadow. He hadn't announced himself. He'd come in through the south fence break, quietly, his badge in his pocket rather than on his chest. He'd been there for half an hour, and he had no logical explanation for why he'd come, except that his grandson lived in that valley and his daughter-in-law got her water from Promise Creek. And in the night, after his 3rd glass of rye, he'd finally looked at the bag of Blackwood's gold sitting on his porch, and he'd understood, with the sudden clarity that sometimes only came at 3 in the morning, that he had not put it inside the house. He had left it on the porch, like something he hadn't fully decided to keep. He stood behind the loading structure, and he listened to Clara Sterling talk, and he listened to the people around her answer. He listened to an old black man talk about a barn his grandfather built. He listened to a Mexican farmer talk about water. He listened to a Cheyenne woman say, "We will be there," with a plainness that was more powerful than anything Holden had heard spoken in a courtroom in 22 years of law work. He felt the thing inside his chest that had been quietly rotting shift and move. It did not feel good. It felt like circulation returning to a limb that had gone to sleep. Painful. Necessary. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the edge of his badge. Clara was finishing. The group was dispersing back through the creek paths and the brush breaks. Silas was talking to 3 of the Morales men near the fence line. Holden stepped out from behind the loading structure. Clara saw him and went absolutely still. He held up one hand, empty. He walked toward her across the feedlot floor, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. He stopped 6 feet away. He looked at the people moving away through the brush. He looked at Clara. "I heard enough," he said. She looked at him. The look on her face was not forgiving. It was the look of a woman taking measure. "You've heard enough for 6 months. she said. Yes, he said, I have. The honesty of it surprised her. She could see that. She hadn't expected it. He hadn't either. Actually, it had just come out of him, direct and unadorned, because, after 6 months of careful dishonesty, a small piece of the truth had a way of wanting to move. She studied him for a long moment. What are you planning to do about it? She said. He looked toward the main road, in the direction of the jailhouse, in the direction of the office, with the light burning on the second floor. He reached into his pocket and put his badge back on his chest. It sat there in the morning light, dull and familiar and slightly crooked. He straightened it. I'm going to do what I'm paid to do, he said. The part I was paid to do before somebody decided the badge was negotiable. Clara looked at him for another long moment. She nodded once. It was not a warm nod. It was the nod you gave a man who was doing the right thing at the end instead of the beginning. It acknowledged what was happening without pretending that the last 6 months hadn't. He accepted it. He'd earned worse. Silas had come across the feedlot, stood beside Clara, and looked at Holden with eyes that held 6 months of burned barns and unanswered pleas, and a woman dangled over a gorge. Holden met his eyes. If you're here tomorrow, Silas said, you'd better be standing in the right place. I know which place that is, Holden said. He turned and walked back through the south fence, break the way he'd come in. Behind him, the feedlot was emptying out. The families were moving back through the brush and the creek paths, going home to their damaged and defiant lives. Getting ready. The sky was fully light now. The sun was up, and the day was beginning. The last day before whatever was going to happen. Tomorrow happened, somewhere in town. Thaddeus Blackwood was in his office, with the second-floor lights on, somewhere in the alleys. Elias Thorne was waiting with a pocket watch and a promise, and somewhere in the valley below Promise Creek. 30 families were looking at the morning sky and thinking about water, and what water meant, and what they were willing to do about it. Clara stood in the empty feedlot with her medical bag at her side, and her wrists wrapped and her jaw set, and she looked south toward the valley. All right, she said to herself, to the valley, to tomorrow. Silas stood beside her, not touching her, not speaking, just there. That was enough. The morning came in hard and bright. No gentle gray this time. No slow arrival. The sun hit the Kansas plain like something that meant business, burning off the last of the overnight cool in the first 20 minutes. By 7 o'clock, the main street of Cedar Bend was already warm and entirely too quiet for a Tuesday. Clara had slept 3 hours in Isaiah's spare room, lying on a narrow cot with her coat over her and her medical bag on the floor beside her hand. She'd woken before dawn, checked Silas's wound in the early lamplight, and eaten half a piece of sweet potato bread, standing at Isaiah's kitchen window, watching the dark slowly become something else. Now she stood at the corner of the alley behind the hardware store and looked at the main street, and understood immediately that Blackwood had moved first. He had them at the hitching posts. 6 people, roped to the iron posts in front of the Cedar Bend Land and Cattle Office, with their hands bound at the small of their backs and their feet together. She recognized most of them from 20 feet away. Eugene and Patrice Calloway, the couple who ran the dry goods store. Pete Sawyer, still in his nightshirt. The old man who played harmonica on the bench outside the feed store every evening. A young woman named Dolores, who worked as a seamstress and had no involvement in any of this beyond the bad luck of living in Cedar Bend. And 2 men she didn't know well, but had treated in her clinic. A freight hand named Birch, a homesteader from the North End, whose name was Garfield something. 6 people, terrified, in the morning sun. Blackwood stood on the raised boardwalk in front of his office. He was dressed precisely, the way he always was. Dark coat, clean shirt, hat on straight. He stood with his hands behind his back and his feet slightly apart, and he looked like a man presiding over something that was proceeding exactly according to his expectations. 12 of his men were positioned along the street, on the boardwalk, in doorways, on the roof of the hotel across the road. 2 of them she recognized from the canyon gorge, pale and bandaged and standing with the careful posture of men whose injuries had not yet been allowed to rest. Elias Thorne was not visible. That bothered her more than anything she could see. Silas was beside her at the alley corner. He'd taken in the scene in 3 seconds and processed it in 3 more. He planned this last night, he said, while we were at Isaiah's. Yes. Clara looked at the 6 people at the posts. Pete Sawyer's head was drooping. He was old, and the morning was hot, and he was frightened. She wanted badly to go to him. He knows I won't leave them there. That's the point, Silas said. I know that's the point, she exhaled. He wants the deed. He thinks he can still get the deed. Can he? She looked at him. No. Something in her voice made him study her face. She kept it neutral. She'd been keeping things quiet inside herself for a long time. She was good at it. What do you know that I don't? He said. Later, she said. Right now, I need to go out there. His hand came out and caught her arm. Not hard. Just enough. Clara. The sound of her name in his voice did something she filed away for later. She looked at him. Whatever you're planning, he said. Tell me. She looked at the street. At the 6 people at the posts. At Blackwood standing on his boardwalk with his hands behind his back. I transferred the deed, she said, 3 weeks ago, before any of this started. She watched Silas absorb this. I had been in contact with a federal land trust office in Topeka for 2 months. A woman there, a federal administrator named Margaret Holloway, helped me find the legal pathway. She paused. Promise Creek now belongs to a federal Native American land and water trust. The Resting Wolf Band is the named recipient. It went through officially 8 days ago. Silas was very still. Blackwood can't buy what I no longer own, she said, and if he tries to seize it by force, he's not stealing from a frontier doctor. He's seizing property from a federal trust. She met Silas's eyes. He'd be fighting the United States government. The quiet in the alley was absolute for 3 full seconds. You had this, Silas said, the whole time. The deed transfer. Yes. The copies of the transfer documents. Yes. She pulled 2 folded papers from inside her medical bag. They were legal documents, dense with official language, bearing 2 separate stamps from the federal land office in Topeka, and the signatures of 3 administrators. I brought them with me when Blackwood's men took me from the road. I had them in my bag when they had me at the gorge. A brief pause. I was never going to sign his deed. Silas looked at the papers. Then at her. He could still kill them, he said. The 6 people at the posts. He could, she said, which is why the people from the feedlot need to be in place first. She looked at him. Are they? He looked at the rooftops. The alleys. The freight yard at the south end of the street. He was reading the town the way she read a patient's face. Give me 20 minutes, he said. He went. She waited in the alley and watched Blackwood pace his boardwalk and tried to keep herself from going out there before the time was right. Pete Sawyer lifted his head and squinted in the sun. Dolores, the seamstress, had her eyes closed and her lips moving. Clara couldn't hear it from across the street, but she thought it was probably a prayer. 20 minutes passed. Then 22. Silas came back to the alley. He was slightly out of breath. They're in place, he said. Clara straightened her coat. She picked up her medical bag. She ran through the legal language of the transfer documents one more time in her mind, making sure she remembered which signatures were where and which stamps meant what. She had spent 2 months learning this. She had sat up with Margaret Holloway's letters until midnight, reading and rereading the federal land statute language until she understood it well enough to explain it to anyone. She was a frontier doctor who had also become, out of pure necessity, a student of federal property law. Stay close, she said, but not too close. How close is too close? If you're standing next to me when I walk out there, he shoots first and checks the paperwork later. She looked at him once more, brief and direct. If I'm alone, he wants to see what I have. He wants the deed. He'll wait. Silas looked at her for a moment. She could see what it cost him to agree to this. It was written plainly across his face, the same face that was always half-shadowed and that she had spent 2 days learning to read. At the first wrong move, he said. I know, she said. She walked out of the alley. The main street was bright and wide and completely exposed. Her boots on the packed dirt made a sound that seemed very loud to her in the morning quiet. She walked at a normal pace. She did not hurry, and she did not slow down. She kept her eyes on Blackwood, where he stood on the boardwalk. She watched him see her. She watched his face do the things she'd expected. Satisfaction. The quiet, contained satisfaction of a man who believes the situation is proceeding on schedule. His men along the street stirred. Hands moved toward guns. She kept walking. When she was 20 feet from the boardwalk, she stopped. "Miss Sterling," Blackwood said. He sounded almost warm. "I'm glad you decided to be reasonable." "Untie them," she said. He smiled. "The deed first." She reached into her bag. She produced the 2 folded papers and held them up. He could see them from where he stood. Official paper, dark stamps, multiple signatures. His eyes went to the papers. She watched them sharpen. She crossed the remaining distance to the boardwalk and held the papers out to him. He took them. He unfolded the first one. He began to read. Clara watched his face. It was something she would remember for a long time, the way it moved through the stages. The slight frown of a man encountering something unexpected. The deepening of the frown as the unexpected thing became clear. The very particular stillness that followed. The stillness of a man who has just understood something and is not yet certain what he is going to do with that understanding. His eyes went through the document. Once, then back to the top again. Slower the second time. He flipped to the second document. The street was silent. He lowered the papers. His face was very controlled. That was the thing about Blackwood. Even now, the voice, when he spoke, was flat and deliberate. "This was filed 8 days ago," he said. "Yes, this land is now property of a federal trust." "Yes." He looked up from the papers and looked at her. His eyes had gone to something harder than she'd seen in them before. Not anger exactly. More like the calculation of a man rapidly restructuring his entire approach. "I should have you arrested," he said. "For what?" she said. "For legally transferring my own property to a federally recognized trust." She kept her voice level. "I'd be very interested to hear the charge." A long silence. "You did this before I made my offer," he said. "I did this before your men dragged me to a gorge and dangled me over a river," she said, "which I think legally qualifies as the point at which your offer stopped being an offer and became a threat." Another silence, longer. She watched him weigh it. She watched him understand that there was no version of this where he seized the water rights without confronting the full legal weight of the federal government. She watched him understand that 3 federal stamps and 4 federal signatures on 2 official documents were not the same thing as a small-town doctor whose mail he could intercept and whose movements he could control. She watched him decide that this was not over. She saw it in his face. The moment it shifted from legal calculation to something colder. The moment Thaddeus Blackwood decided that if he couldn't have the water, he could at least make an example. He turned his head toward his men. "Kill them," he said, quietly, the same tone he'd used for everything else. "All of them." Clara took 3 steps back from the boardwalk. That was all she had time to do. What happened next happened fast, and then seemed to slow. Silas stepped out of the alley. He walked to the center of the main street, and he stood there, and the morning sun put a long shadow behind him. And he looked at Blackwood's 12 men the way a man looked at something he had already decided about. "Hey," he said, loud enough to carry the length of the street. Every one of Blackwood's men looked at him, and in that moment, while they were looking at him, the town moved. It did not move dramatically. It did not announce itself. It simply appeared. From the roof of the hotel, a rifled barrel slid over the parapet edge, followed by the weathered face of Tomas Morales' oldest son, a 22-year-old named Enrique, who had grown up hunting pronghorn on the Kansas plain and had not missed a shot on the pronghorn in 3 years. From the window above the closed dress shop, Ruth Keene's considerable shoulders filled the frame. A double-barreled shotgun across the sill. From the alley, on the north end of the street, Marcus Dupree and 2 of his neighbors stepped out with long rifles. From the roof of the feed store, the livery, the barber shop, the freight office on the south end. From behind the water trough, in the middle of the street, from the gap between the jail and the saddle shop. Farmers and freighters and homesteaders and freedmen. A Cheyenne woman's son with a hunting rifle. Pete Sawyer's neighbor with a pitchfork. People who had built things from nothing in a hard land and who had decided, in an abandoned feedlot the morning before, that they were done running. 40 people. Not all of them armed with guns. Some with tools, with axes, with whatever they had. But all of them there. All of them visible. Blackwood's men saw them. One of the men on the boardwalk took a step back. Then another. Then a third. Silas stood in the middle of the street and let them look. He let the arithmetic of it settle over Blackwood's hired guns. 12 men against 40. And the 40 had rooftops and angles and the kind of desperation that made a person aim straight. Untie those people, Silas said, not to Blackwood, to the nearest of Blackwood's men, a broad man near the hitching posts. Right now, the man looked at Blackwood. Blackwood's face was stone, a rifle cracked from above the freight office. Not aimed at anyone, a warning shot. Deliberate, into the dirt between two of Blackwood's men. They both jumped sideways. The broad man near the posts went to his knee and began cutting the ropes. Blackwood watched this happen, and his jaw went tight, and the control in his face thinned in a way Clara hadn't seen before. She was behind Silas now, at the edge of the street. She watched Blackwood's expression the way she'd watch a pressure wound that had been building too long. "You've made a very serious mistake," Blackwood said. He was speaking to Silas, but his eyes were on the town around him, recalculating, counting, adding and subtracting. "I've made a few," Silas said. He kept his hands loose at his sides. His right hand rested near his holster. "This isn't one of them. You are a drifter," Blackwood said. "You have no stake in this town, no property, no people here. You have nothing." The voice was picking up an edge now. The flatness was going. "Walk away. Walk away right now, and I will forget this entire episode." "You know I'm not going to do that," Silas said. A sound from behind and to the left of Silas. A footstep in the alley, beside the barber shop. Silas heard it at the same moment Clara did. She saw Silas go still. Elias Thorne walked into the sunlight. He came into the street from the same alley where they'd faced each other the night before. He came in unhurried, hands visible, the watch chain gleaming at his vest. He took a position 30 feet from Silas, and he squared up in the way that had nothing casual about it. "There it is," Elias said. He sounded tired, genuinely tired, in a way that Clara hadn't heard in him the night before. "I told you to walk away, Silas. And I told you the choice was still open." It was Elias's pale eyes moved briefly to Clara, then back. "It's closed now." The main street went quiet in a way that was different from all the other quiet. This was the specific silence of people who understood that what was happening between these two men was not something they could intervene in. Clara felt it from where she stood. The held breath of 40 people, the rooftop guns, all of it, waiting. Silas and Elias looked at each other across 30 feet of Kansas dirt. Clara watched Silas's face. She'd spent 2 days learning it, and she read it now with everything she had. She saw what was in it. It wasn't fear. It wasn't hatred. It was something that had no clean name. Two men who'd pulled each other from ditches and burning buildings. 6 years of shared roads and shared campfires and shared sins. A friendship built in the worst possible circumstances and maintained because the worst possible circumstances required it. Silas's hand had not moved toward his gun. "Don't do this, Elias," he said. "It's what I'm paid to do. You could be paid to do something else." Silas. The tired quality in Elias's voice was real, and it was deep. "There's nothing else." Clara watched Silas absorb that. She watched him understand what Elias meant. She thought about what Silas had said in Isaiah's kitchen. He stopped. Elias didn't. And what separated them, in the end, was not opportunity or circumstance. It was a single decision made in a single moment that one of them had made and the other had not. You couldn't make that decision for another person. You couldn't. "I'm not drawing on you," Silas said. Elias looked at him. "I mean it," Silas said. "I'm not going to shoot you." "Then you're going to die," Elias said. Flat, true, not a threat, Just a fact delivered by a man who dealt in facts. Maybe, Silas said, but I'm not drawing on you. Elias stood very still for one moment. Something moved in his pale eyes. She couldn't identify it. It was too deep and too fast, and it was gone before she could name it. His hand moved. The draw was faster than anything Clara had seen in the gorge. Faster than Silas at the gorge. Even. And that had already been faster than she'd thought a human hand could move. The gun cleared the holster and came level in a motion so practiced it had lost all its individual parts. And then the shot came. But the shot was not from Elias's gun. It came from the left, from the direction of the courthouse steps. Clara's head turned before the sound finished echoing. Roy Holden stood on the courthouse steps, with his pistol leveled and his feet planted. He had come out of the courthouse door behind Elias's line of sight, quiet and deliberate, and he had taken his position, and he had waited for the moment when Elias drew. He had shot Elias's gun hand. The gun went spinning into the dirt. Elias cried out, a sharp sound, and went to his knee. He grabbed his right wrist with his left hand and looked at it with the expression of a man who is assessing damage before he decides how to feel about it. The hand was wounded, badly, but he was alive. Silas had not moved. He stood in the street with his gun still in its holster. His eyes were on Elias. Clara watched Silas look at Elias on his knee in the dirt, and she watched something in Silas's face release, slowly, like a breath held too long. Holden walked down the courthouse steps. He kept his gun out. He walked past Silas and stopped and looked at Blackwood's men along the street. His badge was on his chest. She could see it from where she stood. Drop them, Holden said, the voice of a 22-year lawman that hadn't entirely gone away, despite 6 months of Blackwood's gold. Every one of you, right now, hands up and guns in the dirt. A pause that lasted 3 full seconds. The broad man at the hitching posts let his gun fall first. Then the man on the boardwalk to Blackwood's left. Then the third, and the fourth, and down the line. The sound of guns hitting dirt, one after another, like a strange percussion, until it was quiet again. Elias sat in the dirt with his wrist wrapped in his left hand. He was breathing through his teeth. He looked up at Silas. Silas crouched down. He looked at the wrist, then at Elias's face. Let me get her, he said, meaning Clara. Elias said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, he said, you are genuinely the most irritating person I have ever known. I know, Silas said. Elias looked at his wrist. He looked at the gun in the dirt. He looked at Blackwood on the boardwalk, who was now standing very still with 2 rifles pointed at him from across the street, and the expression of a man who is rapidly understanding that the situation has become irreversible. Fine, Elias said. Clara was already crossing the street. She crouched beside Elias and opened her bag. The wound was through the meaty part of the palm, below the thumb, away from the major structures she would have worried about. Painful, serious, but manageable. She worked quickly and efficiently, the way she always worked, cleaning it and packing it and wrapping it with bandage from her bag. Elias watched her work with an expression that moved through several things. She didn't look at his face. She focused on the hand. Does it matter, he said to you, what I am? You're a patient right now, she said. That's what you are to me. He was quiet while she finished the bandage. The hand will work again, she said. You'll need proper suturing within the next few hours. I can do it at the clinic. She tied off the bandage and looked up at him. If you want. He looked at her for a long moment. Why would you do that? He said. Because you're hurt, she said. That's the only reason I need. He had nothing to say to that. Across the street, Marcus Dupree and Tomas Morales had come down from their positions and were moving toward Thaddeus Blackwood, who had not moved from his boardwalk. Holden was directing the surrendered men toward the jailhouse. Enrique Modown from the hotel roof, and was helping Pete Sawyer, who had finally been cut loose from the post and whose legs were unsteady in the morning sun. Blackwood watched his men being disarmed. He watched his careful 7-year plan being disassembled in public on a Tuesday morning in a small Kansas town. His face had gone through anger and calculation and had arrived somewhere on the other side of both. in a place that was quieter and harder, and more like simple defeat than anything Clara had expected from him. He stepped off the boardwalk. He walked toward the street. He walked directly into the path of Stan's-in-Waiter's son, who was 16 years old and taller than his mother, and who stood in the street with a rifle held across his body and the level eyes of someone who was not going to move. Behind the boy, Stan's-in-Waiter herself stood on the boardwalk in front of the land office, Blackwood's land office. She stood there in the morning sun with her arms at her sides, and she looked at Thaddeus Blackwood with the expression of someone who had been looking at men like him all her life. He stopped. Marcus Dupree came from behind him, Tomas Morales from the right. 3 other men from the north end of the valley closed from the left. Blackwood looked around at them. He had nothing in his hands. No gun, no deed, no gold bag. Just his precise, dark coat and his clean shirt, and the ruins of a plan he'd spent 7 years building. He sat down on the boardwalk steps and he put his head in his hands, and he was done. The day after was quiet in a different way. Not the breath-holding quiet of before. Something more like the quiet of a room after a long argument finally settles. A quietness with room in it. The kind you could move around in without catching your elbows on anything. Cedar Bend spent the morning in the particular busyness that follows a crisis. People who had been hiding came out of their houses. The dry goods store opened for the first time in 4 days. Someone swept the boardwalk in front of the jailhouse, which held Thaddeus Blackwood and 9 of his men, and which would hold them until the federal marshal arrived in 3 days, which Holden had arranged by telegram before the sun set on the day before. Elias Thorne was not in the jail. He was in Clara's clinic, in the bed nearest the window, his hand properly sutured and his face turned toward the ceiling, with the expression of a man who was reckoning with something large and was doing it alone and in silence, which was the way he seemed to do most things. Clara had told him he could stay until his hand was well enough to travel. She had not told him where to go or what to do after that. She had said simply, when she tied off his last suture, and he'd asked why she was bothering, what she always said to patients who were trying to argue themselves out of being cared for. "Because you're hurt," she'd said. That's all. He hadn't said much since then. He'd asked once, early in the morning, whether there was coffee. She'd brought him a cup, and he'd drunk it without a word and put it on the table beside the cot. That was the full extent of their conversation, she thought, watching him from the doorway while he looked at the ceiling. That there was a person in there who had not entirely decided what kind of person he was. She had seen that in patients before. People at junctions. People who hadn't yet committed to the next road. You couldn't choose it for them, but you could make the choosing possible. That was all you could do, and it was not nothing. Isaiah came by in the morning with food and with the kind of company that did not require much talking. He sat in the chair by Elias's bed and opened his Bible and read quietly. Not sermonizing, not directing anything at anyone. Just reading in a low voice that filled the clinic the way good, steady heat filled a room. Elias looked at the ceiling and listened. Clara left them and went to work. There was a great deal of work. She went first to the Dupree farm. Lena and Marcus had come home from the Morales place that morning and were standing in the yard looking at the space where the barn had been. The foundation was still there. The stone base their great-grandfather had laid. The fire had taken the wood, but it had not taken the stone. Clara examined Lena's smoke-burned hands and changed the dressings. Marcus sat on the stone foundation of the burned barn and looked at the valley spread out below them, green and gold in the morning light. The creek glinting in its channel, a quarter mile to the south. "It's still there," Marcus said. "Meaning the creek, meaning the water. It's still there," Clara confirmed. He nodded. He put his hands flat on the old stone foundation. He felt it the way you felt something that had survived. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. She went to the Morales farm, then the Pickett place, then the North Farms. She moved through the valley the way she always moved through it, house by house, family by family, the work of the day being what the work always was. A wound dressed here, a fever checked there, A child's sprained wrist examined for fractures, the ordinary, essential work of being present in people's lives, at the moments that required presence. The valley was not fixed. A barn was still ash. Fields of winter wheat were cut and burned. Real losses that would take real time to recover from. She was not going to pretend otherwise. But the creek ran. The water was in the federal trust now. Margaret Holloway in Topeka had confirmed by letter 3 days before the kidnapping that the transfer was complete and binding. Blackwood could spend whatever money he had left on lawyers, and he would not find a way through a federal land trust statute. She had read that statute until she understood every word of it. The valley was not fixed, but it was still theirs. She got back to town in the late afternoon. She checked on her patients at the clinic. Elias had eaten lunch. Isaiah was gone. Elias was sitting up in bed with Clara's medical catalog open on his knees, reading of all things, the section on bone fractures. He looked slightly embarrassed when she noticed. "How long did you study?" he said. "Meaning medicine." 7 years, she said. "Correspondence courses and apprenticeship under a physician in Abilene." She came and checked his bandaging. "Clean, no seepage." "Good. And I've been studying every day since." He looked at his hand. "At her work. Clean sutures, even spacing. Tension exactly right." "You're good," he said, flat and honest. No flattery in it. "Yes," she said. "I am. A small moment." Then he said, "It's a lot of work to do for people who can't always pay you." "They pay what they can," she said. "Mrs. Pickett paid me in jam for 3 years. Tomas Morales fixed my clinic roof. Isaiah split firewood for me every October." She closed her bag. Money is one way of exchanging value. It's not the only way. Elias looked at this. He turned it over, the way she'd turned things over in the canyon. Like a person checking an object from all angles. "Isaiah sat here for 3 hours this morning," he said, reading his Bible. "I know, he never said a word to me." "He didn't need to," she said. Elias looked at his hand again. She left him with the medical catalog and went out the back of the clinic into the small garden she kept there. Herbs and simples and 2 productive apple trees. She needed to be outside. She needed the sky over her head and the ground under her feet, and she needed a moment that belonged just to her, without a patient in it, or a crisis, or a decision. She stood in the garden and put her face up and felt the afternoon sun. It was very good. Simply that. Very good. She heard the sound of a horse at the street side of the clinic. She knew that sound. She'd learned the particular quality of it over 2 days of listening. She went around the side of the building. Silas was saddling his horse in front of the clinic. He had his saddlebags over the horse's back and his bedroll tied at the rear. The horse was a solid gray animal with a patient face and the look of a horse that had covered a lot of ground and expected to cover more. Silas was tightening the cinch with the practiced efficiency of a man who had broken and made camp 1,000 times. Clara stood and watched him do it. He was aware she was there. She could tell by the slight change in his movements. Not stopping, not turning, but aware. She had known, she realized, that this was coming. She'd known it since the cave on the first night when he'd sat by the fire and said our past shapes us. She'd known it in the feedlot when she'd looked across the space and seen him watching the families, with that expression of something being revised, and then turning away like a man who didn't trust himself to look at the thing he was being revised toward. A man with his kind of history could carry it 2 ways, as a chain or as a compass. She had told him it didn't have to be a chain. Whether he'd heard, that was his to decide. She crossed the distance and stopped beside the horse. Silas finished the cinch. He patted the horse's flank once. Then he turned and looked at her. The evening sun was behind her, and it put a warm light on his face. All of it, the lines and the scars and the tired eyes and the set jaw, fully lit for once. "You could stay," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "People like me don't stay. People like you," she said. She let the words sit there between them, not arguing with them directly, just observing them. "Is that something you know, or something you tell yourself because it lets you keep moving?" His jaw moved. He looked at the horse. This valley needs men who know how to build. she said. Not men who know how to leave. She stepped closer, not so close that he could mistake it for anything other than what it was. Intentional, direct. You've been leaving since before you stopped doing the things you're ashamed of. You leave before anything can ask you to stay, before anything can expect something from you that you're not sure you can give. She kept her eyes on his. That's not humility, Silas. That's a habit. He was quiet for a long time. The street was mostly empty in the early evening. A wagon went past at the far end. A dog trotted along the far boardwalk with tremendous purpose. The light was going gold on the false fronts of the buildings and on the dust of the street. What would you have me do? He said, low. Serious. I need help at Promise Creek, she said. The transfer is complete and the water is safe, but the land around the main channel needs clearing if we're going to run irrigation lines down to the South Farms. I need someone who can work fence line and who knows terrain and who is not afraid of hard physical labor. She paused. The Duprees are rebuilding their barn. They could use another pair of hands. The Morales boys are replanting the burned wheat field, and they need help with the drainage on the east side. He looked at her. I'm asking you to help me plant wheat at Promise Creek, she said. That's what I'm asking. The simplicity of it landed on him. She watched it land. Not a grand bargain. Not a redemption story with a tidy bow. Just work. The ordinary, necessary work of building something in the same ground where something had been damaged or lost. The sun was going lower. The gold on the buildings deepened. Silas looked at her for a long moment. She let him look. She let him weigh whatever needed weighing. She was not going to pull him in. She was not going to argue him into it. She stood where she stood, and she let the choice be his. He looked at his horse, at the open end of the street, at the road that ran north out of Cedar Bend and kept going, flat and wide, into an open country that asked nothing of you because it had no memory of you. He looked at the clinic behind her, the garden at its side with the herb beds and the 2 apple trees, the sign above the door, hand-lettered, that said Sterling Medical, E. Clara Sterling. He looked at her. She held his gaze. She had learned, in 2 days, that he needed you to hold it, that he was watching for the moment when people decided they'd seen enough and looked away. She did not look away. He reached down. His hands went to his gun belt, the heavy leather belt with the worn holster and the bone-handled Colt that had done what it had done at the gorge and in the canyon, and in the middle of Cedar Bend's main street, in the morning light. He unhooked the buckle. The belt came loose. He held it for a moment, its full weight in both hands. Then he let it go. It fell into the Kansas dust beside his boot with a sound that was very ordinary. Leather on dirt, nothing more. He looked at her hands, at the bandaged wrists, at the steady hands of a doctor who'd spent 9 years building something that mattered in hard country. He held out his own hand. She took it. His hand was rough and scarred and warm. She held it without ceremony, the way she held things she intended to keep. I don't know anything about wheat, he said. I'll teach you, she said. I'm a slow learner. I have time, she said. Behind them, the clinic window caught the last of the evening light and threw it back in a warm rectangle across the street, somewhere in the valley below. Promise Creek was running over its stones the way it always had and would keep doing, indifferent to the things that humans built and lost and built again around it, patient as only water could be patient. Roy Holden came out of the jailhouse across the street and looked at them standing there in the evening light. He watched for a moment. Then he reached up and unpinned his badge from his chest. He held it in his palm. He looked at it the way a man looked at something he was returning to its rightful owner, which, in this case, was not a person but a standard he'd temporarily stopped meeting. He walked across the street to where the town council chairman, a dry goods man named Abner Cross, was locking up his store for the evening. Clara watched Holden stop Abner Cross. She watched him say something. She watched Abner Cross's eyebrows go up. She watched Holden place the badge in Abner Cross's hand with a deliberateness that had finality in it. He said something else, shorter. Then he shook Abner Cross's hand and walked away down the boardwalk, not toward the jailhouse, away from it. She thought that whatever came next for Roy Holden was not going to be easy. Penance rarely was. But the most important thing you could do when you'd made a sustained series of wrong choices was not to make the next one wrong too. He'd managed that. In the end, she would take the end of the story that was offered to her. Silas was looking at the horse. The horse was looking at him with the patient expression of a horse that has made a great many journeys and has no strong opinion about the next one. He needs a stable, Silas said. Isaiah has a small barn at the back of his property, Clara said. He's been asking for someone to help repair the south wall for a month. I can fix a barn wall. I know you can. They stood there in the last of the evening light. The street of Cedar Bend moved around them in its ordinary evening way. Lamps coming on in windows. The smell of supper from somewhere down the block. The sound of children's voices. Distant, in the direction of the residential streets east of the main road. Dolores the seamstress came out of her shop to sweep her front step. She looked at Clara and Silas standing in the street. She raised a hand. Clara raised one back. Normal, all of it. Quiet and ordinary and warm. Silas picked up his gun belt from the dust. He walked to his saddlebag and opened it and put the gun belt inside and fastened the strap over it. The gun was still in the holster. He might need it again. This was still Kansas, and the world was still what it was. But it was packed away and covered, and not riding on his hip like a statement about what he was. He took the horse's reins and led him off the street toward Isaiah's place. Clara walked beside him. The sun went down. The creek ran south through the valley in the dark, cold and clean, and entirely indifferent to the smallness and the largeness of everything that had happened around it. It ran through the Dupree farm, where a stone foundation held the memory of an old barn and the beginning of a new one. It ran through the Morales fields, where cut wheat would regrow in the spring, because that was what wheat did. It ran past the northern flats, where two families of the resting wolf band watched the water move and knew for the first time in a long time that they held a legal claim on it that no single man's money could reach. It ran on, under the spring stars, under the Kansas sky, toward the valley and through it, and past it, the way Promise Creek had always run, keeping its oldest and simplest promise, that it would still be there in the morning, that the water would come. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations. And so as the sun sets over Promise Creek, we are left with more than the ending of a Western tale. We are left with the sound of water running through a valley that almost lost its soul. Clara Sterling did not fight for gold, glory, or revenge. She fought for something far more sacred, the right of ordinary people to live, to work, to plant, to drink, and to build a future on the land they had already suffered to claim. In a world where powerful men like Blackwood believed everything could be bought, Clara reminded us that some things are not for sale. Water is not just water in this story. It is dignity. It is survival. It is memory. It is the promise that tomorrow can still belong to those who have been pushed aside today. Silas Vance's journey teaches us another truth. A man is not only the worst thing he has ever done. His past was marked by violence, regret, and choices he could never fully erase. But when the moment came, he chose differently. He stepped out of the shadows. He put himself between cruelty and the innocent. He refused to let his old life decide the rest of his days. That is the quiet power of redemption. It does not always arrive with grand speeches or easy forgiveness. Sometimes redemption begins with one hard choice, one hand offered, one gun belt laid down in the dust, and one decision to stop running. Clara's strength was not the strength of someone who never felt fear. She was afraid. She was hurt. She was hunted. But she kept moving because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is what a person does when fear has every right to win, but does not. Clara understood that one woman standing alone could be broken, but one woman standing for many could awaken an entire town. Her clinic, her hands, her knowledge, and her compassion became a kind of weapon stronger than Blackwood's money. She healed people first, and in healing them, she reminded them of their own worth. This story also shows us that evil often survives because good people stay silent too long. Sheriff Holden's fall was not sudden. It happened slowly, with every excuse, every bag of gold, every time he looked away. But even he reminds us of something important. The next choice still matters. A wrong road does not become right simply because we have walked it for a long time. At some point, a person must stop, turn around, and accept the cost of doing what should have been done from the beginning. Holden could not erase his failure, but he could refuse to fail again. The people of Cedar Bend teach us the deepest lesson of all. Blackwood looked at farmers, widows, immigrants, freed families, and native families and saw weakness. He saw people who could be frightened, divided, and priced out of their own future. But he misunderstood them. Survival had already made them strong. Loss had already taught them endurance. When they stood together on that main street, they proved that power does not only live in offices, banks, or gun belts. Power also lives in neighbors who refuse to abandon one another. And perhaps that is why Promise Creek matters so much. A creek does not argue. It does not boast. It simply keeps running. Through fire, greed, grief, and fear, the water keeps its promise. In the same way, good people must keep theirs. To show up. To protect what is right. To care for the wounded. To stand beside the vulnerable. To build again after something has burned. In the end, this is not just a story about a doctor, a drifter, and a corrupt cattle baron. It is a story about what makes a community worth saving. It tells us that land is more than property, that justice is more than law, and that love is more than romance. Love is staying. Love is rebuilding a barn. Love is sharing water. Love is teaching a broken man how to plant wheat. Love is believing that even after the darkest night, the creek will still be there in the morning. So when we leave Clara and Silas, walking into that fading Kansas light, we do not leave them at the end of something. We leave them at the beginning of work, healing, trust, and a future earned the hard way. And if there is one lesson this story asks us to carry, it is this. The world will always have men like Blackwood, men who try to own what should belong to everyone. But as long as there are people like Clara who refuse to sign away their conscience, people like Silas who choose to become better than their past, and communities brave enough to stand shoulder to shoulder, then hope will keep running, just like Promise Creek.